Moin, this is Mark Albrecht, and this is the fourth attempt at doing Houdini tutorials. This time Houdini is going to be the tool in the pipeline, not the final stage. I'm going to bake out some texture for displacement and use that displacement texture on a low-res version of the mesh to spare some polygons. For the moment, please just ignore the third file here in the folder. That is something that we're going to create later on. What I want to achieve is having all the features from the high-resolution mesh on the low-resolution mesh. That saves polygons in the engine, but on render time I can have kind of the full resolution. Baking or creating displacement textures basically works the same as baking any kind of image or color information into texture maps. Only that you're not baking down color, but offsets for the pixels, so that the low-resolution mesh can look just like a high-resolution mesh. The workflow is quite simple, so I'm not going to show you a cleaned up walkthrough that just works right out of the box, but will run into problems and try to show how to solve them. Therefore, this video is not a perfect tutorial, probably, but is trying to show you how Houdini ticks and how you have to tick to understand Houdini. Let's move the mesh back to the origin. If you want to clear out or set a value to its default value, then hold down the Control key and press the middle mouse button. That will set any value and even all the values in one line to the default values. Now, in order to bake a texture, I have to put down a bake texture node. Unfortunately, I cannot find it here. And that is because the bake texture is a feature of the output function in Houdini. And this is something that you have to learn with almost any program that uses procedural whatever, because if you have all the nodes that the program will understand in one area, then you just won't find your way through it. Therefore, in most procedural environments, you will find areas, workflows, work panes, monitors, whatever, and you have to know which area is responsible for what function. So let's hop over to the out network in Houdini and put down a bake texture node. Press the tab key and type in texture or bake texture and click return and click on the node. Inside the node you will find a couple of features that we can safely ignore for the moment. There's something about the resolution that is something that you might want to change, but let's start with choosing the low resolution mesh as the UV object and the high resolution mesh as the high resolution mesh. The next thing I would like to change, just in order to see the files in my file system, is the image format that we want to extract. Theoretically, we should be done now. We should be able to press render to mplay, which will bring up a render window, or render to disk. But nothing happens, or in fact, we get a red warning sign telling us that something is completely wrong. If you hold down the middle mouse button over the node, you find the information what is going wrong down here. And in this case, our UV object doesn't even have UVs. So we have to go back to the UV object, to our lowest mesh, and create some UVs. Just click on the Get Me To There arrow and you can dive right into the geometry layer. Yes, I do understand that I'm going over this network view stuff quite fast. But don't worry, I'm really limiting my use of the network view to the very basic stuff like clicking on the little button on the downside of the node to automatically create a connection and then use the tab key and type in the node that I'm looking for. Actually, in most cases you will find the node that you're looking for by just typing in any part of the terminology. Like I did in the out network view when I was looking for the bake texture. I just typed in texture and there it was. So for this simple object, I'm using the UV texture and just create a UV map that is based on each single polygon or face. And I do want to see a bit more of what I'm doing, so I split the screen up into two halves, and then I set the right one to the UV viewport. Let's set the texture type to face, so that we get an island for every single polygon, and the class to vertices. If Houdini does not update the view, then you just switch over to any other class and back to vertices, and that should usually update the view perfectly. This looks like a mess, so I'll add a UV layout node. And with this slider, you can set the padding, that is the space between the UV parts, to something very narrow, because in that case you have more room, you have more real estate for the actual information. However, setting this to 0, some low value, will create a problem later down the line, but I will get back to that. Let's hop back to our baked texture and see what happens. We still get a red warning, and what's going on? There's still no UV map. Why is there no UV map? That is because we have set the visibility to the original layer. So we have to activate the last step in our UV creation, and then Houdini is happy. While Houdini is rendering out our displacement map, let me try to rephrase what has happened. We didn't deactivate the last node. The problem was that we had the blue button, the rightmost button, the Show Me This Node button, set to the original node, which is the geometry without the UV map. So the UV map didn't actually get created. This is something you have to watch out if something isn't working the way you expect it to. Just have a look if you have a blue button somewhere on top of your network. The blue bample should be way down in your network at the last node or nowhere at all, because otherwise you stop the execution before all the nodes that come after the blue button. Right, Houdini has rendered what we wanted to have, our displacement map. If you only render to mplay, you can export the current view to a texture file from the menu. Otherwise, you'd use the render to disk button and have a look at your folder and wait until the files are all there. Now that we got our displacement texture, we could set up the shader and the material and what's not in Houdini. But I want to show a pipeline process, so I hop over to Blender. What's the name of this? Modo. With the geometry loaded in Modo, I have to create a material so that I can assign a displacement texture. And this looks all weird. And that's simply because I'm too stupid. I, of course, have to use the UV mapped geometry. So let's get back to Houdini and export the geometry with our nicely created UV map. Make sure that you're only exporting the low resolution mesh and not all of the scene. Otherwise, you have to delete what you don't need in your rendering program. And this looks absolutely unusable. Even if I set the texture map to bump instead of displacement, because the displacement might tear apart my geometry, it's just not acceptable. Fortunately, there's a very simple explanation for what has happened. When I created the displacement, the program Houdini simply put a camera on each face or on each polygon and had a look at the high-res mesh to see where the displacement has to go. Now, if the high-res mesh is penetrating the low-res mesh at various places, one way or the other, the camera may be placed wrongly, may be placed at the wrong space. To solve this problem, simply call up your Bake Texture node and in the Unwrapping tab, set the ray bias to something higher. In this case, a 1 will nicely do, but you may have to set it even higher. You have to try that out. What this bias is doing is simply moving the camera that is creating the displacement information a little bit further away from the low-res mesh, so that it has a wider area to cover and will find more information about displacement. The second thing I want to correct is if you have a look at the Modo output, you can see that the seams of the UVs are pretty much visible. The reason for this is what we call bleed in print. That is a very small area around each actual texture tile that has been filled in with the color of the outmost pixel. So that in a perfect world, you don't get any seams in your texture. But in this case, since we set the padding between the UV tiles to 0, the bleed is covering the next UV tile. So we have to adjust the padding to the same value or something higher than our bleed value, and then we should be fine to go. Checking this out in Modo tells us that again we forgot to export the geometry with the correct or edited UV map. Let's delete the old version of the geometry and load the new. And now you know why I'm changing over to Houdini. Redo it from scratch. This is something you get used to in Modo. Redoing everything from scratch over and over again. Load geometry, put on the material, and load in our texture file. Right, we should reduce the displacement distance a bit, because after all this polygon mesh here is very low resolution, and adding a bump map using the same texture might even add more detail. So far, so well, okay, better than before, I'd say. If you want to bring over more information like normals or curvature or whatever, you simply add more output images in the bake texture node in Houdini, and that will create the additional information files. The big red file that is being created contains all the layers, so you can open that in mPlay and simply browse through the texture layers and export what you need. Or, like I said, you create the exports right in the bake texture node by simply adding more images. But before Modo is going to crash again on me, that's the way it is. In the next couple of videos, I'm probably going to tackle modeling, editing geometry, creating some scene files, maybe do a bit of rendering, and then I go over to rigging and animation and what's not. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. I'm really only beginning in Houdini, but I love doing these tutorials or videos, approaching Houdini from the point of view of a completely no-up and bloody greenhorn. And if you want to join me, if you find this helpful, let me know. Thanks.